You've been hearing me talk a lot about Rob Arsenault and weather my trains, but how about I tell you about my experience? I can sum it up with one word: easy. My first weathering job was a locomotive, and Rob made it simple. He sent me easy to follow shipping instructions, and in just a few minutes at the local post office, it was off. And the results? Absolutely amazing. As promised, Rob notched up the realism with an amazing weathering job, and it wasn't too long after that, my rolling stock was heading his way. And now you can make it even easier by ordering your next Bowser, Intermountain, Rapido, or Scale Trains locomotive from Weather My Trains. For more info, visit their website at weathermytrains.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me tonight, just outside of Ithaca, New York, Bruce Ryan. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Really interesting conversation you and I had just a few days ago. We were chatting, and I was learning a lot about, your growing up and in the Manhattan area and all the things that you got to see. And I've really been checking out your YouTube channel, and boy, you've done well with that. 20 videos, and you've got 1.2 thousand subscribers. That's a fantastic following you've got there on YouTube.
I never really imagined that would happen. And I started the channel for a very different reason than building a little model railroad community. I was thinking that, one day I'm going to have to tear this layout down and become an old man and live near one of my children. And I thought, I'd really like to remember this and operating it, which is my favorite part of the railroad. So I started shooting photos and videos to sort of preserve the memory and preserve the history. And It just sort of took off from there. And I found that I really enjoyed making the videos, and the operational part of the layout is my favorite part of it.
Yeah, so it's just a personal journal that you get to share with roughly around 1,200 people from around the world, I'm sure. So
who would have thought?
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So yeah, a lot of great videos on there. You do a lot of operating, and we'll get into that and how you developed the railroad and built the layout, and then obviously filming these operating sessions. We mentioned that you grew up in Manhattan. I'm kind of curious because I'm not too far from New York. New York's about a 2.5 hour ride from me. And I've spent some time in Manhattan, and it sounds like you got to see some of the history that I kind of enjoy when I look at these areas. So tell me a little bit about what you remember growing up in Manhattan.
Well, I grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We lived in a 21-story apartment building on the 11th floor. And I was 5 years old, and I shared a room with my brother, my younger brother, and we had a corner bedroom, and we looked out one window and saw Lower Manhattan. We watched the World Trade Center get built out of our bedroom window.
Wow.
The Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, Statue of Liberty, and the bay where the ocean liners crossed after coming in from the ocean and heading up the west side of Manhattan. And I was ocean liner crazy as a kid, probably even more than trains for a time. And then out the other window, we saw the East River, freighters from the Belgian line parked at Pier 36, almost right outside of my window, close enough that with a pair of binoculars, you could see what the captain was having for dinner.
Awesome.
Oil tankers parked just across the river, and just a little bit to the left was the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So we saw about everything you can imagine going up and down the river, from battleships and aircraft carriers and freighters and car floats and tugboats and all kinds of things. But my first love was the subways and the ocean liners. I had developed an interest in trains by then, so took an immediate liking to the subways once I got used to the noise and the rocking back and forth. And the ocean liners, the first summer that we lived there, my dad took us up to the west side to watch the Queen Elizabeth sail. And boy, as soon as that horn blew 3 times as it's backing out of the pier with the help of tugboats, and the ground shook and my stomach rumbled and my brother cried, it's like, I'm in love with
Yeah.
these things.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll leave quite an impression on a young fella. Imagine, even, I'm just thinking about you looking out that window and you're seeing all like I guess the tourist stuff that, somebody that's not, from Manhattan likes to see, and you got to see it all through, basically the window of your home. And I go down there now and you go by all those piers and now you see athletic fields and everything, but you must have been able to see a golden era of the piers in action.
Yeah, I was at the tail end of the ocean liner era. So this was the 1960s. So some of the ocean liners that, were famous in the 20th century, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the United States, those were nearing the end of their life when we lived there. And some of their replacements, like the Queen Elizabeth II, the QE2, we watched on her maiden voyage. And on Saturday nights, used to go to the pier where she was docked, and you could board about 7 o'clock and walk around for a couple of hours, and then they'd kick you off, and she sailed about 9:30. So we got to watch that, and it's one of my favorite things to do, to go watch the ocean liner sail from the west side. And um, as I look back on that now, as we drove up the West Side Highway from Lower Manhattan, my eyes were fixated on the river and the piers and the liners, and anticipating what liner was going to be docked at the pier that day. Often I knew, but not always. And by doing that, I missed what was on the right, which was all the terminal railroads of New York City. Not all of them right there, but terminal railroads on the west side of Manhattan, starting at about 15th Street and going up to 37th Street. There was the Central Railroad of New Jersey, Lehigh Valley, B&O, Erie, New York Central, Pennsylvania Railroad. They all had some combination of, float bridge, a warehouse, and a yard. And in all of those, cars arrived by car float and were moved under the West Side Highway over to the yard and distributed to a warehouse of some sort. Only the New York Central had rail access to Manhattan. Everyone else had to use a car float. So I missed all that because I was focused on the ocean liners.
The big ships distracting you from the railroad.
You bet.
When did you start to, notice you mentioned that the subways kind of were attractive to you for a little bit. And when did freight railroads really enter the picture?
Much later, probably after I was married and met my father-in-law. And he's the one who cemented my interest in the New York Central. He worked in the towers around Rochester, New York for about 13, 14 years as a towerman. And after I was married and we'd go visit, he and I would do rail fanning around the Rochester area. And by then, we were in the Amtrak era, so passenger trains were far fewer on that line than freight trains. So that generated my interest in freight trains. Though when I built my first real layout, it was my fourth layout, but my first real layout, it was a model of Albany Union Station, and it sat in part of the area where my Manhattan terminal sits now. There's a wall that's 35, 36 feet long, and I modeled Albany Union Station along that wall, almost to scale. I think Albany Union Station had 9 tracks and I had 8, but the platforms and the coach yard and the commissary and the mail and express tracks were all not exact replicas, but someone would have recognized it, I think, if they looked at it. So I enjoyed the passenger operations for a while, and then there's a whole story I'm sure we'll get to about how that wound up being torn down and the Manhattan terminal constructed in its place.
I'm kind of curious how you get to Albany with your model railroading desires. Is you talk about Rochester and obviously growing up in Manhattan, but what got you interested in the capital of New York and railroading there to build the terminal there?
That started with my father-in-law and my interest in the New York Central.
Yeah.
And through that period of time in my 20s, I gathered up some New York Central books that were available at the time. And I still had an interest in passenger trains, so I had old timetables and railroad guides and things like that. And I would look at, schedules and consists, and became interested in passenger operations. And when I decided to build a layout, I thought, okay, well, what's a good New York Central passenger operation location? And Albany Union Station turned out to be perfect. It had trains coming from New York City that terminated at Albany or originated in Albany and went south. Trains came from the east, from Boston, and
Yeah.
terminated or merged with a train coming from the city. Delaware and Hudson trains came from the north. And of course, the New York Central came from the south and the east and the west. So there was a lot of switching. I was primarily interested in passenger train switching. So having the station, I had trains terminate, originate, stop and drop off a diner or pick up a diner, and had head-end cars to switch to a mail track or a express track and a commissary. And I really looked at old timetables and consists and tried to, match it up the best I could. And, I'd do maybe 2 hours of a day. And back in those days, an hour at a busy time of day, it could have 6, 7, 8 trains coming from all directions.
Yeah, I can see how Albany would be that big hub. You got so much going on it's basically compass rose out of, Albany, north, south, east, west, out of the capital there. And it's funny, I was recently up in Albany in present day, and even then it's some pretty interesting railroading that goes on there. And, even on freight, there was areas that I didn't even realize existed until I was doing work research, and I'm driving all over all these tracks. So there's a lot of neat railroading history there in Albany.
Yeah.
Did you become a history buff or, because of the model railroading, or is that something that was kind of a part of you and then just kind of turned towards the railroads to learn them?
I've always been interested in history, and especially, recreating history, books that recreate history. Growing up, my favorite book was called Collision Course, and it was, a very detailed story of the sinking of the Andrea Doria in the 1950s, which, happened before I was born. But to see that history recreated, and then as I got into my interest in railroading and model railroading, the research was just a natural thing that I enjoyed.
Yeah, because we were talking about, even with your current layout, the amounts of research that you've done, and the things that go along with it. It just can be almost as fascinating as building it itself.
It's great fun. I mean, I enjoy it. I suppose not everyone does, but and the research can come from a lot of places. With the Albany layout, I was lucky enough to find a couple of guys who were engineers for the Penn Central back in that era. So this is post New York Central, but still they knew a little bit about how Albany operated in their day. And in one case, he had been there a while. So yeah, but there's books, there's maps, there's Sanborn maps, there's magazine articles, all kinds of things to research, talking to people, and it's all fun. It's all enjoyable to just kind of piece it together and learn what you're trying to model.
So was it in your 20s, your first venture into model railroading? Was it the first time you had done anything with it?
Well, other than that, I guess we didn't talk about this yet. When I was 6, and my interest in railroads was already well formed at that point. My parents got me for Christmas a 4x6 piece of plywood with a dog bone shaped loop on it, with a Tyco F7 and 3 New Haven Railroad passenger cars that lit up when you put them on the tracks. And that was my first foray into model railroading. And interestingly enough, my brother and I had a bunk bed in our room, and that sat under the bed until we wanted to play with it, and would bring it halfway out. And I brought it halfway out because we were also building the rest of New York City in our room. I had blocks that I would put end to end for piers and put my models of the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth and the France and the United States next to the piers. Had a Kenner girder set for skyscrapers. Had a model of an airport that was like a piece of paper, I guess, with printed runways and taxiways on it, and a terminal building and little model airplanes that were probably about 6 inches long. Had plastic roads and plastic train tracks, and built a little city right there. And that little 4x6 HO layout was part of the city. So here I am, decades later, pretty much doing the same thing.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. And yeah,
Yeah.
you had an interest in all that early, and yeah, so mid-20s, you built this. Tell us some more about this Albany idea and this terminal you built. Where does this get built, and what size is the layout? Tell us about it.
The old Albany layout.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I built that in my 30s, and that was after we moved.
30s.
That was after we moved into the home where we live now, and so some of the dimensions are similar. It was an L-shaped layout along 2 walls, and on one end there was a small staging area, and on the other end, through a wall, there was another staging area that kind of blocked the furnace, so it was lift out. So when the furnace guy came, he could get to the furnace. But from that staging area behind the wall, trains came across a bridge on the approach to Albany Union Station. So I had the station there, and that was most of that 35, 36-foot wall. The station, the coach yard, the mail track was there. The express track was actually on a lower level, but the commissary was up there. And then you go down and around the corner, and then I had a freight switching area at ground level, but the tracks coming from the passenger station were about 2-3 inches above the freight area. So, and then they were connected, which in Albany Union Station, there was a place where you could go from the main part of Union Station down to a lower level to the Delaware and Hudson Station for a time, okay, and to the Railway Express area, and then also a freight yard was down there. So I tried to capture at least the spirit of that. Albany Union Station was modeled pretty closely after the track plan at the station as it existed in the 60s probably. My freight switching area on one leg of the L was probably a little more freelanced.
Now you talk about all this, the research that went into this. Did you do any site visits to Albany to be able to see this in person?
By the time that I was modeling this, Union Station, I believe, was a bank, and everything had changed. So there wasn't much to see. I did go to Albany to go to the New York State Archives or State Library or something. I forget the name. But I went there to look up Sanborn maps, and I printed out a bunch of pages of that whole area at various points in history. And that's actually what helped me develop my track plan.
Wow. So it was, it wasn't an experience. It was all from the research that you had done and this deep dive that you've taken that seemingly became a hobby within the hobby.
And photographs and books helped a lot. I had a collection of New York Central books. So there were, photos of the station, and then trying to line up the photo with the track plan that I was seeing on the Sanborn maps and other maps. And that was fun and interesting, and I never knew if I quite got it exactly right until a book came out later that really showed Albany Union Station and the whole track plan of the whole area. And I felt like I got it pretty close.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. You get some reassurance that your research was done correctly and you've been able to apply it. Now, you talked earlier when you were younger, you had a dog bone. Now we're talking about this Albany layout that you are building. This is a big step from a dog bone to this. What was in between that? And what were you learning about model railroading? And maybe just as much, where were you learning about model railroading to pull off such a big project?
There were a few steps in between that. The first one occurred when I was in high school, and I built a 4x8 layout in the basement of the house we lived in at the time. By that point, we had moved out of the city and up to the suburbs. And so in our basement, I built a 4x8. You may remember those old Atlas blueprint books that had track plans in them.
I may still have one around here somewhere. Yeah,
I
know
might
exactly.
too.
Yeah.
I picked a plan that was basically a 2-track loop with a couple of spurs. And I might have built 2 or 3 buildings. I tried to make a crossing out of plaster that didn't go so well. The road was completely undrivable by any vehicle. And the trains I operated on that, strangely enough, were Amtrak Metroliners. One Christmas, I with some money I received from Christmas, bought an Amtrak Metroliner set, and that's the main trains that I ran on that layout. And that really lasted only a couple of years before I went away to college. And then I was mostly away from model railroading for the years I was in college, and probably for a couple of years after that. But my wife and I moved into our first house in my 20s. And in the basement, I built a 6x16 layout. Double track mainline, had a yard, drew on a track plan from one of John Armstrong's books on track planning for realistic operation. Had that layout probably for 6 years, ran freight trains, ran passenger trains, did not really fully grasp operations, though I was always interested in operations when an article would appear in Model Railroader or Railroad Model Craftsman. I was always interested in that, but never really fully realized the potential for that on that layout, either in the track plan or in the way that I operated. But it gave me some experience laying track and wiring, which I detest. But yeah, that was really my first. I don't know. I think the Albany layout was probably my first real layout that really was, mostly scenic and really had an operating scheme. This 6x16, was the step before that kind of laid some of the groundwork.
So what does the catalyst that takes you from this 6x16 layout to the Albany one and a deeper introduction into operations? Where did that get sparked up from?
Moving to a new house with a bigger basement.
That helps.
Yeah. So the interest was there. And, by this time I'm in my 30s. And from the time I was 6, I always had model trains around in a layout or a 4x6 sheet of plywood, something somewhere nearby. So when we moved into the house in which we live now, the first couple years were spent redoing the basement. It was a basic cinder block basement with a cement floor, and working with my brother-in-law, and my dad in, various combinations over a period of a year or two. We put walls and a floor and electrical power and that kind of thing in. As much for, little kids to run around and play in as it was for a model railroad. So that created the space, and then I had the interest, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Let's go back to the Albany one for a second. How far did you get in? What would you say is the level of completeness of that layout?
Pretty complete. I had it for 17 years.
Wow.
I would say it was probably about 90+% scenic. Although if I went back and looked at it now, my skill level has changed a lot in 20, 25 years. And my ability to visualize the scene and then create it has improved over the years. But in its day, it was mostly scenic. I really enjoyed operating it. I think it was overbuilt. You probably could have had an elephant stand on the benchwork and it would not collapse. Uh, but um,
Better than underbuilt. I'm one of those guys that does the same thing. I overbuild everything, and I've had a few ask me their advice on bench work, and I'm like, you can ask me, I'll tell you, but then probably 3 or 4 other people will tell you that it's way overbuilt. You could probably set engine blocks on the top of the bench work when you're done. But one thing you can say about my bench work is it's not going to fall apart either. It's there to stay. So there is, that happy medium where you don't want to go too crazy, but you want to make it strong so it stays.
it was strong. It didn't need to be as strong, but it was strong. And that really wasn't a problem. The bigger problem was the depth. Most of it was 36 inches deep. It was a shelf layout, but it was 36 inches deep. And then trying to uncouple, it was 50 inches off the floor.
Yeah.
So trying to uncouple a car on the furthest track or two from the edge of the layout, especially passenger cars with diaphragms. I don't like magnets for uncoupling, so I was trying to uncouple by hand. That just got to be frustrating. And
you'd have to be like 6'6" with like a 6'7" wingspan, right?
Yeah,
to get in there. Yeah.
And I'm not near 6'6". But it was also the days before turnouts were DCC friendly.
Right.
And I am not a wiring guy. And I had turnouts that I was early into DCC. This was before sound. It was, maybe a couple of years after DCC became available and really started to become popular.
Right.
So the electrical part of the layout was occasionally frustrating. But by and large, I had downtown Albany. I had photos of Albany as part of my backdrop. I had passenger trains running. I had freight switching. And for the most part, it was a very enjoyable model railroad.
Tell me about an operating session on that. Did you have other people over? Was it just you? How did the operating session go on the Albany layout?
Then it was just me. And the operating sessions really were my own creation based on New York Central timetables, and both employee timetables and public timetables. Public timetables often listed the consist, especially, coaches and where they came and went and diners and all kinds of stuff like that. So I had good information on consist and schedule. And I would take a 2-hour block. I remember doing like 8:30 to 10:30 in the morning. And I would pick a particular year because I had official guides from many of the years of the 1950s. That was the era I was modeling at the time. And I just tried to recreate all the trains that would come in that 2-hour block. And then for variety, I looked at 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I think, and looked at those trains and just tried to recreate the train and the consist and the head end power as best I could, and have a train arrive, switch it, another one come in, and it was hard to do 2 things simultaneously, so I was often running sequentially and not necessarily exactly on the clock.
Right.
I looked at the sequence as they arrived on the timetable, but when I operated, I probably did it more sequentially, paying less attention to, well, it's 9:23, so that train should be arriving.
But yeah, you were simulating what you had learned and, the research and the timetable. So that must have been a real joy.
Yeah.
When does the Albany layout depart and we head back to the Big Apple? When does that all occur? And tell me what made that happen?
Well, we're about 14 years ago now, and my younger daughter went to college in Baltimore. And one weekend, it might have been parents' weekend or something like that, we went down for a visit. And one afternoon went to the Inner Harbor and took a water taxi over to Fells Point, which I had never been to. I'd been to the Inner Harbor, but never to Fells Point. And stepping off the water taxi at Fells Point, I could immediately see an old float bridge. I think there might have been a tugboat dock there too, which of course piqued my interest. I love tugboats almost as much as ocean liners back in the New York City days. So as we walked around, and we did walk, we walked from where the taxi dropped us down a street that had tracks in it, old cobblestone street with tracks, a big long warehouse that was along the water that had clearly been served by rail at one point, but had now been converted to apartments. As we got further away from where we started the walk, you could see, tracks, the remnants of tracks in the streets going in different directions. And something about that just really sparked my interest. I mean, I had the rail marine interest anyway,
Right.
but to imagine, tugboats and car floats and freight and warehouses and urban switching all together just really got me excited, I guess. And
Yeah.
so after the trip, I came home and I started looking at my Albany layout. And I thought, okay, where can I squeeze a rail marine option into this plan? And I started, doodling track plans and, geez, could I take that switching area over there and turn that into rail marine, or turn half of it into rail marine? Or can I take the staging area and convert it to rail marine? Do I really need that staging area? And whatever I came up with felt like a force fit. Wasn't quite happy with it. So I continued the research. And again, the research was a really fun part of that for me. I came across Thomas Flagg's books on New York Harbor railroads. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but there's a 2-volume set that was fairly new at the time, with color pictures of all the railroads that touch New York Harbor in some way, including the major railroads we would think of, the New York Central, the Pennsy, Lehigh Valley, and all the rest, but then also some of the terminal railroads that I probably saw growing up, but really didn't realize what they were. The J Street Connecting Railroad in Brooklyn, which I could actually see out my bedroom window, but never realized it was there.
Right.
So that sort of got me interested. I went from there to starting to look at Sanborn maps of the west side of Manhattan and a shore of Brooklyn, the shore that I could see out my bedroom window, because that was the most interesting part to me, and found, track plans for the terminal railroads. And those terminal railroads, by the way, there were probably about 36 of them or more throughout the 5 boroughs of New York. And essentially freight cars arrived by car float, got pulled off the float, sometimes taken to a small yard, sometimes delivered to industries, but those whole railroads were only a few blocks long. So the concept intrigued me of, car float, rail marine, freight switching, urban switching. I'm a one-town railroad guy, and every railroad I've built is kind of like one town, and it's always been urban. So this was really kind of speaking to me. I came across a really fantastic website about New York terminal railroads. It's still up today, but it had every terminal railroad in New York listed. You could click on a link and get photos and maps and information and lists of customers and all kinds of things. And that really got the juices flowing. And so I was starting to get excited about modeling New York City, and tried to figure out, well, how am I going to do it? Maybe I could cut off the Albany layout at that freight area and have 2 layouts, a passenger layout and a New York City freight layout. I think what finally tipped the scales was discovering Lance Mindheim's books on building a shelf model railroad. I think he had a series of 4 at the time, but it
Yep.
was building, operating shelf model railroads. And his book spoke to me for a few reasons. One was the concept less is more, and I've heard a number of people on your show mention that concept, and that spoke to me, given that I felt parts of my Albany layout were a bit overbuilt and complicated. So I like the less is more. I like the idea of taking 15 or 20 minutes to just switch one car at an industry. That spoke to me too. I like that relaxed pace. I had some experience operating on another layout in my area that was really intense. Um, and I liked the feel that was conveyed in his work about a more relaxed, less is more setting. And of course, then he was talking shelf layouts, which I had already built, but reading the book, I realized mine didn't need to be 3 feet deep.
Right.
I could make it a lot smaller. I could have fewer tracks. I could have fewer turnouts and still have as much fun. So the layout now that I have is 2 feet deep along one wall, and the rest of it is 18 inches deep. And, as far as operating and the visual and reaching in to uncouple a car at an industry is all so much easier. So all of those things that I mentioned, that research and coming across Lance Mindheim books, that all happened over a course of, say, about a year after that visit to Baltimore. And I don't know, one day the decision, I woke up and the decision was done. I'm just tearing down that Albany layout. I can't force fit New York City into Albany.
Yeah.
The whole thing's going to go. And so with my brother's help, we tore the whole thing down and carried it out and stuck it behind the garage until a junk man came and took it away.
Wow. Was there any hesitation in doing that? I can imagine. I think about that with my layout from time to time, what I've got, and eventually I want something bigger or better and improve upon what I have. But it's kind of hard to think about, having a stage where I don't have a layout again. Was there any hesitation in that, or was it just, I don't care, it's got to go?
Well, there was hesitation because I liked passenger operations, and I hadn't fully embraced freight operations in my mind. And I liked replicating Albany Union Station, and I liked having the New York Central passenger trains flow around my basement. Right. And as I was doing all that research until the last moment when everything clicked, I was trying to find a way to take all this rail marine New York City stuff and combine it with Albany and, just hitting conceptual roadblocks. But once I decided to do it and I got excited about, a rail marine operation set in New York City, and by that time I had discovered the High Line and New York Central operations within Manhattan, so I could keep New York Central. Once everything clicked into place, it's like, okay, see ya, we're done. Let's tear this sucker down and get going on the new one. And I'm a fairly impatient modeler. So once I decide I want to do something, I want to do it and not wait. And, that often leads to me going back and improving it later, but I have the satisfaction of having it done a little sooner. So it got torn down fairly quickly. The new benchwork got built fairly quickly, maybe over the course of a month or two. We tore one down and built the other. And then once the new one was built, I started on track work right away. And the way I go is, lay some tracks, get them wired, and test out running some locomotives, even if it's a fairly short stretch of railroad, right, just to see something run.
I think in that is the little victories, right? You got to keep the flywheel turning and stay motivated. And when you are able to at least get the trains running, even in a small section, it keeps that flywheel turning. It's small steps and, that gratification thing.
Yeah. I guess the way I would describe that, and one of my approaches in my, my professional work life, as well as my modeling life, is follow the energy. And once that trip to Baltimore happened, my energy was, I need to learn more about rail marine. I need to learn more about New York City. I need to learn more about the High Line and shelf layouts and freight switching and, all of that. And then the decision clicked in, and the energy was, let's tear down the old and build the new. So I still follow that principle today, I guess, with, laying track or redoing a scene or painting and lettering freight cars or whatever it is. I'm kind of a follow the energy person, and helps me get things done, but also helps me enjoy what I'm doing, which is the most important thing.
Absolutely. So tell us, you talked about these lessons learned from the previous layout about deep bench work. What's the bench work look like for the current layout?
I actually followed Lance Mindheim's construction techniques as he outlined in the shelf layout books. So it's brackets on the wall and hollow core doors, 18-inch hollow core doors around most of the layout, 2 feet, with 1-inch or 2-inch foam on top of the hollow core doors.
Definitely shallow, going for that shelf type thing. No more long reaches, no more big step stools to reach in and do all that switching. Everything's right at your hands, huh?
Absolutely. And for the most part, I'm a big buildings guy. I like the feeling and the visual of the big buildings dwarfing the trains. And if you've watched the YouTube videos, you've probably seen that. But pretty much all the way around the layout, the backdrop is, 1 or 2 or 3 buildings deep, and they're all significantly taller than the train, multi-story buildings.
So tell us a bit more about the Manhattan Terminal Railroad as it exists and kind of its purpose and what you've been able to incorporate. I know you told me how it begins and ends, but why don't you tell the audience here a little bit about the function of the railroad?
It's an urban switching layout. So as you mentioned, it's 75 linear feet. And on one end is a car float that more or less serves as visual staging. And on the other end is what I call the Riverside Food Terminal. And basically, urban switching is my thing. Any particular car would be unloaded from the car float and taken to 30th Street Yard, which was on the west side of Manhattan. Mine has 8 tracks. The real one probably had about 8 million tracks. And then once the cars are in the yard with the switch list, and I can talk if you want about how I get to this point, but basically then cars are distributed to industries, customers around the layout. I have 16 customers and 60 car spots. Some of them are right up in 30th Street Yard, and others require a train to basically go south of the yard to a couple different switching districts, or you could say it's one big switching district, because I have 2 different names that I use for districts down there, but it's really kind of a switching area at the other end of the layout. So the purpose of the layout is urban switching, and that's what I enjoy.
For somebody that's not familiar with the car float concept, where are the cars coming from before that are being put on the car float that's landing there in Manhattan? Where are they coming from?
Do you mean in real life or on my layout?
On your layout, yeah.
So conceptually, they come from Weehawken or other places in New York.
Okay.
The New York Central had a major yard in Weehawken, and routinely sent cars by car float to its 2 yards on the west side of Manhattan, one at 30th Street and one at 60th Street. The car float at 30th Street disappeared before the era that I'm modeling, but the float bridges at 60th Street, remained for the rest of the New York Central era, and that was a major yard. So I'm modeling 30th Street, and to back up a little bit, the New York Central was the only railroad that had essentially land access to Manhattan, as long as you're willing to accept a bridge as part of land access. But it came down from the Bronx, crossed a bridge at Spuyten Duyvil on the edge of the Harlem River, came down the west side of Manhattan, went through 60th Street Yard, and then came down to 30th Street Yard. If you take an Amtrak train now, it follows the same route.
Okay.
And going into Penn Station is approximately where the 30th Street Yard was. And then from the 30th Street Yard, there was a line called the High Line that was built in the early 30s. That was an elevated freight line down to the lower west side of Manhattan, and it terminated at St. John's Park, which was a 3-block long building and freight terminal. had 7 or 8 tracks that went inside the building. Along the way, there was a food warehouse. There was the Nabisco plant, a couple cold storage warehouses. The meat packing district was there, so those houses were served. So I've chosen to model that area. At first, I was trying to model the High Line, a selectively compressed High Line, especially up around the yard. But I followed the double track and the crossovers and had a lot of the same industries. And, I enjoyed it. But over time, I shifted away from being more of a prototype modeler, not totally, but more so than now, to more of a proto freelance modeler. And I did that to improve operations and improve the visuals of the layout. And I liked the fact that it gave me some creative energy. I think I was feeling a little boxed in by trying to stick so closely to, a particular track plan or, a certain collection of industries. So, yeah, I'm inspired by the terminal railroads of New York, where cars arrive by car float, and then the New York Central's High Line. Those two concepts together really form the basis of the layout.
It's hard for somebody like me who's an outsider. I've been to Manhattan several times and touristy kind of thing. And just imagining having that much railroad going on there. I mean, we know a lot that's underground and, subways and, underneath Penn Station and underneath certain places. But to be able to like that High Line, and you and I talked prior to the show about the High Line, and I saw it there. It's now a walking trail or something, right? The city's done a park or something.
Basically an elevated park.
Yeah, so it's neat, and I love that ghost stuff too. When you find stuff that's remnants of the old days, and that's really neat. But to have all this going on in the city is just kind of mind blowing to me. I know it was an era before, but just like, where the heck would you even fit it in this area? But it was there, and it's just really neat history that you've been uncovered. And you saw it when you were a kid. You may have drove by looked the wrong way when driving by, but it was there when you were in Manhattan, and now you're able to really recreate that really neat history of New York City.
I do remember seeing it, but I don't remember internalizing it in the same way that I would now if it happened to still be there. And of course, none of it is there anymore. Some of the buildings are still there. They've been converted to other uses, but some of those industrial buildings on the west side are still there.
Yeah, it's an amazing history that the city has, and thinking about floating rail cars across the Hudson, and from Jersey to New York City and the West Side is just it's a really cool place. Sometimes I think I was born 100 years too late, because I'd love to go back and see a lot of this stuff in action. Although, I would probably miss my cell phone and everything else that we have in hand, but it would be really neat to see it in action at least once.
You'd only miss your cell phone if you knew that it was about to exist.
That's true. That's true. That's very true. And Doc Brown hasn't finished the DeLorean yet, so we're not going back anytime soon. But we do have your layout and all that history that you've learned and all the research you've done, and now you're applying it even in a proto freelance way. It still covers the way things were done. So the operations, we got car float. How many cars did a car float hold in the prototype?
They varied in size, but 15 to 18 probably would have been typical. Some fewer, some more.
And how many did they have coming across? I mean, was it like a regular thing, or did they have a few, or what? How much was coming across that river?
I couldn't put a number on it, but it was a lot. Up at 60th Street Yard, there were several float bridges, 4, 5, 6, something like that.
Wow!
So you had multiples per day. You go further south of 60th Street Yard, and say the Erie, it had 1 yard, smaller than either New York Central Yard, so I'm sure it had fewer floats, but probably way more cars than we could imagine by looking at it. It's a busy place.
Yeah, it would have been really cool to see. And imagine, like you said, with the research, all the neat stuff you've learned by being turned on by this and doing the research and the books that you've had. So tell me what's the status now of the layout, or as far as complete, where are you at now with it?
Well, it's never complete, as you know. It's 100% scenic. Since I built the original layout, I've built 2 additions, one about 9.5 feet along a wall. And then most recently, last summer, I built a 12-foot addition that is not quite a peninsula, sort of built like a peninsula, but it's up against posts in the basement. So it's not quite up against a wall, but similar idea. So we're 75 linear feet now. It's all scenic, but I fully embrace the concept of continuous improvement. I mean, you know the old saying, model railroads are never done. But a few years ago, I looked at a section of the layout that actually had, for anyone who knows New York City, had the R.C. Williams food storage warehouse kind of recreated on the layout. Big, massive building. It had a siding with 4 car spots. But there was just something about that section of the layout that I wasn't happy with. I'm not sure I could put my finger on it or put it into words, but I wanted I wanted that section of the layout to look grittier and have more old, sort of decrepit looking buildings than, the one warehouse. So I posted on the HO scale shelf modelers group, has anyone ever torn up 15% of your layout and just completely redone it? And the response was like overwhelming, like, yes, do it.
Yep.
Don't hesitate. And I was
Right.
hesitating because I had never torn up that much of layout before. I might have reworked a spur or replaced a building, but I had never torn out, 7-foot section of a layout and redid it. But I
You
did
took
it.
100% of a layout down. So what's 15%?
Well, that
Right?
was different. That was different. But I did it. I love the new section. And since that point, I've actually done that in several other places on the layout. I reworked all of 30th Street Yard. There's an industrial area that I've kind of redone. And so the continuous improvement is a concept that I fully embrace. And I think I've gotten pretty adept at seeing where the layout can be improved and then focusing my energy, as I said, follow the energy. When I get that bug about a piece of the layout, it's going to change. And so you could look at the layout and say, hey, this is all done. But I look at the layout and I could point out 6 spots that, I want to do something about that. I don't know what yet, but I'm going to figure that out and we'll change that. And that's fun. I enjoy that because every time I do it, I like the layout better. And sometimes I do it for visual improvement and sometimes I do it for operational improvement.
Right. So you talk about these areas that need improvement. What would you say is your favorite part of your layout?
That's a tough one. Because I don't know if I have a favorite, but I could maybe narrow it down to 3. One is the end of the layout that has the float bridge. It has a New York Central tugboat, another tugboat docked, the car float, the float bridge, and when it comes ashore, it comes onto a cobblestone street and an old warehouse building. It's an ITLA model, and I put a big sign on it that says Water Street Pier Station. And I grew up on Water Street in Manhattan, so that piece of the layout, the rail marine connection, kind of the old gritty feel, appeals to me. The second one would probably be that section I described, that 7-foot section that I recently tore out and replaced. Because instead of, a couple of big buildings, one very big building, it has probably 15 or 16 smaller buildings. And they're all brick buildings. They're all heavily weathered to look old and grimy. One of the proto freelanced ideas that I incorporated here is right in front of that row of buildings is a single track that runs along the river. I've always liked that kind of look, even though the New York Central in Manhattan did not have such a spot. I like the look of it, so that piece of the layout I like, and I love running a train kind of along that single track in front of grimy buildings and the river just below. And probably the third spot would be the newest addition, which I call the Riverside Food Terminal. And it's basically 5 tracks. It's actually modeled after 30th Street Yard. 30th Street Yard used to receive a lot of refrigerator cars, and then the trucks would back up right on the concrete and unload produce or meat or whatever it was. So I've recreated that. There's 2 tracks where the concrete butts up against the track and the trucks back up to the cars. And then there's a track between those 2 that can kind of be used for storage or, building a train to go back to the yard or any purpose that's needed in operation, basically. And then the other 2 tracks are really like the arrival track and a runaround. So I really enjoy operating that. That has 15 car spots between the 2 tracks, and the runaround track holds 7 cars. So if you come from 30th Street Yard, the full 75-foot length of the layout, and then you enter the runaround and start switching, it probably takes 45 minutes to an hour to get those 7 cars in place and pull out 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, however many they are, going back to 30th Street Yard.
I know that you will occasionally operate the layout as you desire. How often do you get to have other folks over to operate your layout?
We have an operating crew that includes 3 other guys, and we split into 2 crews. One crew will work the yard, and working the yard means distributing cars from the arrival track, unloading the car float, distributing those cars in the yard, then switching the freight house, switching a mobile oil dealer, switching the Macy's warehouse, a couple others. And then the other crew will take a train south, usually a 10-car train. I believe that the High Line had a 10-car limit and a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit. I've incorporated those into my layout as well. So the other crew will take a train south and switch Riverside Food Terminal, Nabisco, cold storage warehouse, got a Union Freight Terminal, beverage dealer, cement dealer. They don't usually do all of those in any one session, but usually 3 or 4 or 5 of them with that 10-car train. And I try to time the sessions with the crews to be about 2 hours, 2 hours and 15 minutes, something like that.
Oh, wow. Good.
When I operate alone, I plan out a day's operation, and I can tell you about how I do that. But basically, I have a list of cars that are going to be switched that day on this railroad. There's usually about 35 of them, give or take. And then when I'm switching alone, I just do the whole thing in sequence, an hour here, 20 minutes there, 45 minutes there. And, it might take me a week to get through a quote unquote day. So more or less the layout operates the same way, whether it's just me or whether we have a crew here.
Awesome. Awesome stuff. And then if anybody wants to see more of the operating of the Manhattan Terminal Railroad, you can check out Bruce's YouTube channel. That's at Manhattan Terminal Railroad H 9776. And if that's a little too long for you, we're going to put the link right in the show notes and also on the Facebook post. So you'll click right on there, subscribe, hit the bell, and you'll get to see all the videos that Bruce shares, as his personal journal is wide open for everybody to take a look at and enjoy. Some beautiful modeling that Bruce has done, really well represents railroading in the 1960s in New York City. It's done an excellent job, and it's a layout I definitely will need to get myself out to the Finger Lakes area and check out in person someday soon here. But Until then, Bruce, I want to thank you for coming on Around the Layout and sharing your model railroading story.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.